Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Future of Impact podcast. Today, joining me is Sofia Assab. Sofia is a sustainability and economics expert and a recent Columbia grad. After graduating, she is now going into full-time work at Withum as an ESG analyst. Sofia, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about ESG and sustainability, so this is a treat.
Awesome. So I want to jump right in and ask you, you actually broke into the ESG space quite early compared to most people. I want to hear about your story, what sparked your interest, and what you're learning as you begin this journey.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really interesting question because I think we're at this interesting time where before really my year, and maybe a couple years before that, in the 4-year traditional college trajectory, people didn't really have the opportunity to major in sustainability. These programs are really new. So we don't have a lot of people in the past who have backgrounds in specific like sustainable development. Before it was more like environmental studies or environmental science. My major is very specific about bringing in political science, economics, critical thinking, which fits very perfectly into ESG work because it's a lot about critical thinking, working with different companies, analyzing ways in which they can improve to their sustainability footprints. But the way that I got into that, even in the first place, is actually, it happened to me in high school where I was really focused on human rights. I thought I was going to go into a human rights program. I was working in a lot of nonprofits through high school based in just human rights work, not really thinking that much about environment, besides the fact that I've always been really connected with nature. I've always cared, but I never thought it was going to be my career path. And then I went to a really amazing high school that allowed me to take interesting classes. So that's number one luck point. And I took a class called Global Futures, Global Warming. And I remember so vividly sitting in this classroom around all these other young people. We were all seniors in high school. And we were learning about, it was a future-based class. So we were like looking at future predictions by the top data scientists, looking at like what's happening now and what's going to happen in the future. And just looking at like the inequalities from how much people in the US were consuming versus someone in a small country in Africa or even India. And the levels were just staggering. And I just remember looking around and thinking, I can't just go into maybe creative writing and human rights and do this small sector. I really want to be involved with helping sustain this planet, because without that, like we're not going to have human rights, because there will be no humans, or everyone will need human rights, and it's just going to become a massive chaos. So I kind of really started thinking about root issues, and that has been kind of the philosophy that I've focused on in my work in ESG and economics. How to fix something, I believe, is you need to not just do the fluffy stuff on top, like, oh, let's slap on this Band-Aid solution that's going to explode in 10 years. Let's actually think, how do we deal with this? What's the root problem? How do we fix that root problem? And yeah, I got really lucky that I found that passion my senior year. Took a gap year to travel and basically just lived in these small communities where I was interacting with people who were living in a really different lifestyle than I had grown up with. And I realized I'm interested in a specific niche of well-being and sustainability combined. So that's the very short version of how I came into this.
That's incredible. And there's so much to touch on there, but I just want to hone in on one thing you said toward the end, which is that you lived with these small communities. Love to hear a little bit more about that and what lessons you learned from different cultures and different types of people in terms of sustainability, and what we can take, let's say in Western countries or in more developed countries, as lessons to learn from them.
That's such a great question. And I'm very lucky because I actually grew up with dual citizenship between the US and Morocco, which is a developing nation in Africa, in North Africa. And my dad is from there. He's from a small mountain village in the Atlas Mountains, where basically they still live in the indigenous traditional way of living off the land. So growing up in the United States, I have this one life, and then I have this other summer experience sometimes where I go and see my Moroccan family growing up, much smaller footprints. They don't go on these big trips because they can't. And they live off the land. And I just kind of, I've had that perspective. So I think when I went into my travels, I was very focused on kind of looking at this with a more adult perspective, because again, that was my childhood. I wasn't thinking about it as deeply as I was when I was on this intentional year off between high school and college. And I spent most of my time in Southeast Asia. So I was in Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And I was very intentional. I didn't want to go and do service work and just leave and kind of feel good about myself. I really wanted to just live with these people and see how they were living and kind of reflect on my own privilege of being able to go off to a 4-year college. And the most interesting thing that I took from it was actually how visible everything is. For example, I was living on a small island in Indonesia, and where there were no cars. You can walk around the island in an hour. People, of course, live there full time. There were no tourists because there had just been a volcano, so I kind of got to see what it was like without other tourists besides myself. And you just see, like, when they have trash, it doesn't just get picked up by the garbage man that comes every day on my street in New York and it disappears and gets out of sight, out of mind. They're burning their trash. There's huge piles like this, and you see kind of waste right in front of you. And number one, that's why I started to learn, like, wow, in more developed countries, we are able to kind of have this feeling of out of sight, out of mind, which a lot of these small communities don't get. You get to see the difficulties of dealing with waste. And then again, just like living smaller, and also being happier. That was one of the main things, like living small and being happy, not needing to consume as much. Yeah.
It seems like you got some really interesting experiences in the field, and I can definitely also relate with what you said earlier of having dual citizenship and comparing the American lifestyle to another lifestyle, having grown up with dual citizenship in America and Israel. Though Israel is a you know, I guess you could call it first world country or developed country. I definitely noticed that the footprints here are much smaller than in America. Now, on the American side, I want to hear more about your work in New York City, and I would love to get a bird's eye view of the ESG landscape in the city. What's going on? What are you paying attention to? What's exciting to you lately?
Yeah. New York is really interesting because it's kind of like the financial hub of the US. So I think there's more people working in finance here than like per capita than anywhere else or something. That could totally not be true. But just again, like a lot of the product is coming in the financial world. We're not a manufacturing city. We're not dealing with those sorts of issues. But what's really interesting is in my ESG consulting work, when we have a client who's working on a portfolio, or they're a portfolio manager, they're a hedge fund, they're a venture capitalist. What's interesting with working in the finance space in New York is seeing how in the pressure from investors is making the change. And I was actually very hesitant. I mentioned that I worked in nonprofits most of my life until really this past year in consulting. And I was hesitant in making the switch into the private sector. And the reason that I'm happy with the switch and I'm staying here for the time being is because I see the power of money. And I see that a lot in New York. So when we put our dollars where our values are, things change a lot faster. So I'm seeing, again, pressure from investors are making these other companies or people that are handling the money of their investors change, because they're saying, we care about the environment, so you better do something about that. So I'm helping those people kind of work through, okay, how do we do that? What's the steps? What are the steps? Because we've never really had to think about this before, because before all we were thinking about are immediate profits. And that's what's changing. And it's really exciting.
So let's zoom in for a second on that pressure from investors. Like, what has sparked that? Why do investors suddenly care? And what kind of pressure are they putting on their portfolio companies? I want to hear a little bit more about what's going on in that conversation.
Yeah, no, this is a really interesting conversation for me, because I come into the space in a slightly different way, where I'm kind of like, I'll do anything. I'll start having a small little organic farm and raise a sheep and just have like this little society for myself. I'm okay with that. But it's interesting to be in the private sector and seeing how people are reacting, because it's actually coming from this place of risk. So people are looking at the environment as a risk towards the way we currently live, a financial risk. So personally, I wish that people could just care for the sake of caring, but we're at this point where we're caring because we're starting to see true changes. So the bigger companies with more money are realizing, wait, if we don't change now, what is our company going to be in 20 years? We're able to think in the long term a little bit more than smaller companies with less value or assets under management. But what's happening is those larger companies, you see like Google, Apple saying they're zero net, all of that, it's trickling down, and investors are seeing that. They're seeing, oh, these companies are doing that. We need you guys to do that too. That's going to look good for us. So it's a really interesting thing about like looking good, but also reducing risk. And that's a lot of this. If we have a client that maybe isn't so sold on going green just for the sake of it, we tell them, this isn't just about saving the planet, which it is, but it's also about the company isn't going to function if we don't make these changes. We're not in the 1980s anymore where we can just go, not even think. We're in a completely different time. And I think our generation is picking up on that. And as more people are going into the workforce from the recent graduates, millennials, Gen Z, companies are going to change entirely. That's what I'm kind of seeing.
I'm with you entirely. And I think it's very important to frame this in terms of risk, because companies that aren't, really thinking about this as a risky move to not be sustainable, they're going to fall behind. So yeah. I know every company is in its own industry and has its own sustainability journey, but generally, what are the most common risks that you see companies exposing themselves to when they're not taking sustainability seriously?
I mean, the real risks that are freaking people out are the financial risks, because, for example, the SEC, unfortunately, I wish it wasn't the case, but what's happening is people are starting to hear whispers of regulations, financial incentives, sanctions, like slaps on the wrist, where if you're not reducing your footprint by X amount in 10 years, you're going to have a problem. You might get shut down. You might get slapped with fees that you can't even afford. So people are preemptively changing because they're worried about these financial risks. Because, of course, the environmental risks behind that are that we can't keep manufacturing at these rates without, for example, we have companies who are manufacturing. I just did a webinar on zero waste for manufacturers, where we had a lot of our manufacturing clients come, listen, think about this new way of business, which is, instead of making a product that is going to make you some money, it breaks, your client comes back, makes you some more money, which is kind of the traditional way of thinking in our capitalistic society, we are telling them, you will actually be better off if you make a zero waste supply chain, where you make a product that's meant to last. If it doesn't last the way it is, create a repair shop. You can charge the customer something to repair, but you're not creating more and more and more. You're changing the economy. You're moving towards a circular economy. And surprisingly, even though it's not the traditional business method, these manufacturers are interested because they're not dumb. They can see that the future is moving for that, so they need to kind of catch up, or new companies are going to come in and take their place. So it's this mixture of people being truly worried about the rising sea levels, CO2 levels, but also kind of the cultural hum of we're going to get you in trouble if you don't make a change. So there's two risks kind of in playing into each other.
For sure. And I think that you described it as a hum, but it is getting louder and louder. Even, this morning I was reading the New York Times, and there's this bill that's about to be passed in Congress that will provide serious incentives for climate action. They'll not taxes for a lack of compliance, but they do want to incentivize people more and more. And also on the note of brands going more toward a circular economy, the ones that do it well actually reap enormous rewards. You look at brands like Patagonia, which have, very robust repair programs, and people are super loyal to them. I personally own a lot of their products, and it's a big selling point for me. So on the investor side, I understand. And on the company side, I also understand that they're mitigating risks. So now let's get down to the practical steps. If you're consulting for a company and they're trying to be more sustainable, what does the process of researching them look like and understanding where they're at? And what are the key factors that companies should be considering when they're trying to become more sustainable?
The interesting thing about my work is that I get to work with multiple different kinds of companies. For example, a food delivery service company, what we do is we evaluate their company just by asking them a bunch of questions. And I'm not a sustainability person. I'm not specifically working in sustainability. I'm doing ESG, so environmental social governance, which to me is even more interesting because I don't just look at what they're doing sustainability wise. I get to look at what they're doing for their community, what they're doing with their employees, if they're promoting a diverse workspace and inclusive workspace. And what's interesting is that all those things are really interconnected with sustainable outcomes. So if you have happy employees who are feeling good, they feel like they're in a community, you're much more easily able to kind of make changes to your company. Hear your employees' opinions on how to become more sustainable. So it's the best thing is when things happen like bottom up within a company, and we like to promote that. And again, it changes company to company, but the most important thing is really looking at what you're doing to reduce your footprint. And the step one is metrics. And I'm not the biggest like math person. I'm not the biggest data person. I like to kind of look at things holistically. But what I'm realizing is the most important thing is start measuring, because if you don't have numbers, you're not going to be able to see where improvements can be made. So how diverse is your operational sector, or how diverse is the executive board of your company? What exactly, even if you just have one building, how much carbon are you putting into the atmosphere? How can you reduce that? So that's what we're measuring.
Okay, so you mentioned a lot of trends there, whether it's companies trying to become more inclusive or focusing more on employee well-being, or more macro level sustainability with the buildings that they choose to work out of and what cities they choose to work in. So are there any other macro level trends in the ESG world that are catching your eye, whether it's certain industries that are doing really well, certain technologies that are really exploding, or maybe specific companies that you think are doing a good job?
Yeah, I mean, the companies who are willing to make the most changes are the ones who are going to be most successful. Because of course we get people who are just like, I just want to get some more money from my investors. Let me know how I can do that. Help me tell the story in the most appealing way. And then they make a couple changes. Everything they do has to be real. We can't just make up what they're doing. So they have to make those changes, but they're not really willing to change the true foundations of their company. But those, as you mentioned, Patagonia, that is a company that is such a good example of a company that's willing to change the way a company traditionally works. Where, as you mentioned, the ability to repair a good, huge. If companies are willing to do that, they're willing to go outside of the model that's been built for them in the past 20, 30, 40 years. Those are going to be the most successful companies because they also have more loyal clients. As you mentioned, people are changing the way they want to buy things or the way they want to invest. If a company has a sustainability even statement on their page and it's all truthful, people are more willing to shop there. It's just the way that you're putting yourself out into the world as a company is going to make you more successful.
I agree, and I think that what you're saying between the lines is that companies that take this seriously are going to need to be seriously creative and innovative and sort of break the mold in terms of how they're thinking about these things, because the issues of ESG have gotten so serious that people really need to, they can't, rest on old tools that they've learned, and they need to constantly innovate. So one thing that we're hearing about more within the ESG world that companies are starting to incorporate more is volunteering. So I want to hear a little bit more about how volunteering can fit into an ESG strategy from your perspective. And if you have any specific companies you work with or that you've heard of that do volunteering, would love to also hear a little bit more about your analysis or your take on those.
Yeah, as I mentioned, ESG is not just sustainability, it's about more. It's about company community, which is where volunteering comes in. And one of the biggest issues that we've seen, and one of the biggest issues that companies have a hard time managing, because you have a high CO2 level, there are steps that you can take to deal with that we all know. But if your employees are unhappy or they don't feel a sense of community in the workplace, and they're not really putting the amount of work that they could put in because they're thinking about going home at the end of the day, that's like the harder issue to solve. And we've found in our research that implementing a volunteer program, whether that's just a paid to volunteer program or making that a possibility, giving access to volunteer organizations, that creates a much more stronger employee workspace. And those employees stay longer, higher retention rates. And we're working with a client who is having a hard time retaining employees. And our number one recommendation has been create a volunteer program for them, because instead of people feeling like we're just coming in to do this work that maybe we're not so passionate about, find something that's related to the work they're doing, set up a volunteer program, and you're probably going to have very likely going to have those people much more passionate about the work they're doing, because they can feel like they're making a difference. Because again, I think that one thing that has been missing in the last couple of decades in the workspace is we kind of just created the system where you go to work, you make some, in a lot of fields, you go to work, you make some money, you go home, 9 to 5, methodic. It's all about making money, all about making profits. Again, as you said, that's changing. There's a change happening right now. And adding a volunteer program into the workspace is part of that cultural change that we're seeing, number one, employees want, and also employers want. Because the best thing about ESG is that there are huge benefits to making these changes that both the employees and the employers see.
That's fantastic. And I want to hear a little bit more about the benefits of volunteering. So do you think it's confined only to HR goals in terms of retention and engagement, or do you see other organizational benefits beyond the HR space?
I think that I think that retention is probably, if you're looking at it from an employer perspective, that's what because we're kind of thinking, okay, what does the employer want to hear? They want to hear that this has proven to increase retention. But if you're looking at it from an employee perspective, which is also extremely important to us as consultants, if I was given the opportunity to go volunteer and get paid to do it and feel like I'm making a difference in my community, what we're seeing is that people are leaving work happier, they're living happier. It's not just about retaining people in an employment, it's about creating an overall society of happier people. My senior research at Columbia was based in how is sustainability and well-being interconnected. And the trends show that if you are feeling good in your body, feeling good in your community, feeling involved, feeling like you're actually connected to something, you're much more open to making changes in your personal lifestyle, such as reducing your waste or going a little greener, thinking about things more openly. So if you want to just look at it on a piece of paper and strip down everything, retention, great. But there's so many more benefits that trickle down into every kind of facet of society with anything that connects you more to your community.
I agree, and I think that that's what makes volunteering so transformative. So my second to last question is, do you have any advice for companies looking to implement a volunteering program, whether it's paid or not?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned before, even but much to my dismay, metrics, numbers matter. So I think some companies could just say, "Oh, let us know if you volunteer. We'll post it on a board." A kind of disorganized volunteer program or a volunteer incentive structure. I would say the most important thing, if a company wants to implement a volunteer program, whether it's paid or not, is to have a way to track it, to show their employees the options, to also see what employees are interested in. I know that's the work that you guys are doing, trying to make this easier for people. And I think the easier it is to do something like that, the more companies are going to be able to adopt it. Because creating a program from the ground up, what I'm seeing is no one really has even if people are passionate about this, they don't really have the time because they're working on other stuff. So if we're able to make that easy, that's how we're going to start seeing more and more companies adopting volunteer programs.
For sure, it's got to be easy, it's got to be measurable, and it's ideally also got to be accessible within the workplace, whether it's the remote stuff or all kinds of other things. My very last question for you is what's on your mind? If you have anything to share with us, a thought to leave us with, would love to hear it.
Yeah, I think that as I've kind of been hinting at, it's really the risks, sure, great. Like their financial risks are what are moving people, but what we should really be thinking about, especially people who are considering where to work, what to do with their career, if they want to make a career change, focus on something bigger than just profit making. Um, this is a serious issue, and we need to make drastic changes. We need to be creative and we need to think big. And I think that there are a lot of new companies doing things like that. And if old companies can work with those new companies to improve, great. But support the people that are doing the right thing.
Amazing. I think everyone has a lot to learn from you in terms of how seriously you're taking this and how you're really pushing this forward in your own space. Thank you so much for joining us, Sophia.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.